Thank you very much. I'm Bianca Evans. I identify as a queer survivor of violence, a white woman living on stolen land. I have a lived experience of psychosocial disability, and I work at Women with Disabilities Victoria as a Gender and Disability Workforce Development Program Manager. Helen?
I'm Helen Freris. Hello, everyone. I identify as a woman with a disability. I'm totally blind. I'm also cisgender, and I am living and working on Aboriginal land. It's very nice to be speaking to you.
Thanks, Helen. Next slide, thank you. I'd like to start this by respectfully acknowledging the people of the Greater Kulin Nation and the custodians of the lands and waterways on which we are gathered today. Many of us are gathered from many different locations, so I'm going to go with a broad brushstroke there. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to elders from other communities that may be with us today. I also acknowledge that the land was never ceded and that we are living, working and playing on stolen land. We're going to talk to you today about prevention from an intersectional perspective of gender and disability. Now, we definitely acknowledge that there is many different intersections that come with gender, but the focus at WDV is very much on gender and disability. Helen, would you like to talk a little bit more about what WDV does and who we are?
Yes, thank you. And that will take us to the next slide, I believe.
Thank you.
Yes. So Women with Disabilities Victoria, for those of you who don't know about us, Women with Disabilities Victoria, or WDV as we will refer to it in this presentation, is the peak organisation for women with disabilities living in Victoria. We're a non-profit organisation. We're established and run by and for women with disabilities. Most of our staff and all our board members are women with disabilities. We are a membership organisation, and women with disabilities are very welcome to join our organisation as members. So we work with the vision of a world where all women are respected and can fully experience life, whatever that life is that they create. Our mission is to advance social and economic inclusion of women with disabilities in the state of Victoria. And we focus on areas particularly where we know that gender and disability have the biggest impact, intersectional impact on social exclusion. So areas such as the prevention of violence against women, obviously, and we also focus on making service systems relevant and responsive to the needs of women, such as the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We promote access to health services for women with disabilities, and we work to support women in empowerment and leadership as well. So we're going to outline a few of our activities, and to do that first, I'll pass to Bianca.
Thanks, Helen. Okay, so we know that women with disabilities are disproportionately affected by violence. So some of you will be very aware of that, and some of you will be kind of entering this kind of space and kind of orientating to that. And one of the things that we do know from that is that women with disabilities aren't always targeted by all the programs. Not all programs are accessible, or initiatives kind of focus on those spaces. So that's one of our primary focuses. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Gender and Disability Workforce Development Program does, and Helen will talk a little bit more about a different program. But our main focuses are really on upskilling workforces to increase prevention contributors, increasing the disability workforce within the prevention sector, to influence policy and practice, and to increase the evidence base around disability and violence prevention. There's not a lot of sex segregated data out there when it comes to disability. So a lot of the time we are making, estimated research-based guesses on how things are kind of sitting within disability spaces in Australia, but also in the world in a larger space. So the Gender and Disability Workforce Development Program has 4 kind of areas that we really focus on. And one is providing consultancy to our prevention partners. And one area is also creating the Experts by Experience working group that we brought together about 18 months ago. And this is a group of 12 women with lived experience of disability. They come from a diversity of disabilities, a wide range of backgrounds, and are very skilled. And we've built capacity with them to talk about violence, to talk about disability and gender inequity, and ways to move towards gender and disability equality. So the group is a consultancy group. It consults on our resources, products, training, a whole range of things for us, but also to our partners as well. And a few of you that are here today, I'm sure that have worked with that group. So that group's been quite popular, and it's been a really great initiative because it's one of those things that are prevention in and of itself. So it's not only promoting prevention, it's also working to create leadership opportunities for women with disabilities, to increase representation of women with disabilities, to debunk stereotypes and kind of challenge them, and to do a whole range of things. Another part of our program is training. So we do a lot of training within workforces, especially disability and social service workforces. And during the COVID context, we've had to adapt, as many of us have, to create a space where we can do prevention work online. And that has not come without challenges, but it's been quite a successful adaptation in the end. We've got now 3 sessions that we run over 3 hours as a training series that looks at the introduction to gender and disability prevention, and then looks at kind of looking at the drivers and the essential actions with that disability lens on it, and then looking at bystander and a little bit of disclosure kind of stuff at the end of that 3rd session. So that's been a really important adaptation to us during COVID. One of the things that we do know from COVID kind of context for women with disabilities is that women with disabilities have historically been quite isolated and kind of on the edges of society at different times through history. And we don't want to lose the gains that we have made through prevention work and through, social movements around disability that have happened in the last 50 to 60 years that have been really important to kind of gaining that representation and things like that. But COVID has kind of driven people back into their homes and into those spaces. So it's not only had a massive gender impact and affected women disproportionately, but it's definitely affected women with disabilities quite disproportionately as well. Another element which brings us to the last one I'm going to talk about is resource development. And I'll get you to swap to the next slide for me, please. Now, one of the resources that we've recently developed that will be launched on our website very shortly, we're just kind of sneaking it in here today, is a condoning of violence resource. And this is a fantastic example of the intersection that we put across this work to look at disability. And in this sense, we look at how condoning of violence against women with disabilities looks, what it feels like, and we talk about deficit language. As I said, this will be available on our website shortly. It looks at how we kind of victim blame, how we shift blame, how we justify, excuse, trivialize, downplay violence against women, but also with that disability lens to look at how, when someone has a disability, it's far easier for people to say, oh, well, he was stressed, he wasn't coping, he's been such a great carer, and kind of have that kind of almost halo effect about, that excusing and justifying that, well, this is a difficult situation. But also just ways that we talk about people with disabilities and women with disabilities specifically. Things like, she has the mentality of a 3-year-old, so she just doesn't understand, or it doesn't impact her as much. And we know that language is really outdated and not appropriate. And so we wanted to create a space where we had, what to avoid, and then what to think about when we're using anti-violence messaging, and then how we can frame disability from a strength-based perspective and move away from that kind of vulnerability kind of language that happens within society. So that's some of the things that we've been working on, and I'll pass over to Helen to talk a little bit more about what she's been working on as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Bianca. And I think we're on to the next slide if we're not already there.
Thank you.
So one of the areas that we work a lot with in women with disabilities is supporting organisations to create inclusive environments and to prevent violence against women in inclusive ways, and to recognise the disproportionate prevalence of violence against women with disabilities as opposed to the general population. So Women with Disabilities is, in fact, considered a statewide women's health organisation. We're part of that network, but we're very aware that women's health services locally do a tremendous amount of work and have done so over many years to prevent violence against women, to mobilise local women and to create partnerships which together have a real impetus in prevention of violence that is being carried out. So one of the areas of the health services portfolio is how can we resource women's health services to make sure that the perspectives and rights of women with disabilities and their participation is part of the prevention of violence against women work that occurs. And that's received tremendous support, actually, well, for a long time, but particularly since the Royal Commission against violence against women in Victoria. And we gratefully acknowledge our funders who've supported us to be able to resource the women's health sector really well in that space. So at WDV, we appreciate the key role held by women's health services, but also local women in their communities. And we support them to link in with initiatives that are already occurring. So we, as part of the Women's Health Capacity Building project, which I'll briefly talk about and then share or preview a resource that we're going to be launching again on the 3rd of December, about how we do this. So we offer technical assistance and training, and that can take the form of one-on-one consultation with women's health services and also presentations to networks such as this conference. And we adapt materials with a disability lens. So we have a resource that explores the drivers of violence against women and the essential actions for its prevention, and we place a disability lens on that, which we share with our women's health service partners who are familiar with the Change the Story framework, as I'm sure everyone here is or will be doing so in the next few days. We recognise that women's health services are very committed to intersectional practice, and there's a lot of interest and acknowledgement and a thirst for knowledge, really, about how women with disabilities can be supported in communities and how violence can be prevented against this population group. We also know that there are varying levels of knowledge around disability, the levels of violence against women with disabilities, the rates. People are often quite surprised when they hear the statistics, but also how can inclusion effectively be implemented in a practical way? What does inclusion mean, and how can women's health services make sure that they are actually putting that into practice? So we have produced a number of resources. One of them is will be an auditing toolkit. And auditing sounds quite harsh, but it's really not. It's a way of supporting women's health services to engage in a process whereby they explore a number of aspects of prevention of violence against women based on the capability frameworks for prevention of violence against women and the Change the Story framework, just to see how they're progressing in the inclusion of women with disabilities. So the toolkit that we have created is based on a number of areas, particularly around the essential actions of promoting gender equality between women and men with and without disabilities, promoting women's decision-making and involvement in public life. So we can see on the slide, for those of you who can, there are a number of areas that are very broad, and it might surprise you, and you might be having conversations with yourself and your colleagues later on and thinking, how do these areas apply to prevention of violence against women? And we know that when services, programs, and facilities are accessible and involve women in their design, implementation, and evaluation, they are likely to promote the rights and perspectives of women, empower their voices, and ensure that those perspectives aren't perhaps minimised or ignored. So we can see the areas: resourcing, partnerships, organisational strategy, organisational capacity, and resourcing. So how do organisations, for example, we ask people to, as they go through the toolkit, think about, well, how do organisations acquire knowledge about women with disabilities? What partnerships do they create that involve women with disabilities and their organisations? How is inclusive prevention of violence work resourced? Is it budgeted, or is it something that happens at the very end when someone remembers that that's probably a good idea? And then we ask people through the audit to inquire of themselves and their organisations about the attitudes that prevail within the organisation and the capacity of the organisation to create inclusive environments for women to engage in the activities that women's health services offer, but also as staff, volunteers, and equal partners in the process of prevention of violence. So are women's health services accessible environments where women can be employed? Are they places where women feel if they attend events, their perspective will be included, welcomed, and will they be able to access the event on a very basic level? So we talk about the communication techniques that are used to engage local women. Are they accessible? Are they in formats that women with disabilities can access? How are women with disabilities represented in the communications issued by Women's Health Services? Do they do social media and other images include women with disabilities as part of the overall strategy? And how are women with disabilities portrayed? Are they portrayed as individuals, or is there always reference to carers whenever women with disabilities appear in communication? And then an important one is leadership. We've talked about employment already, but is it possible for women with disabilities to become part of the leadership of women's health services and or prevention of violence against women programs? And we take people through in the resources, in the toolkit, a series of questions to explore how possible is that and how open is the environment to the leadership of women with disabilities. And for women who work voluntarily for women's health services or prevention of violence programs, is there remuneration or support offered? Or are we perhaps perpetuating the stereotype, perhaps unthinkingly, that women with disabilities are always available to be volunteers and do so for goodwill and don't have, require any sort of acknowledgement or remuneration? We've briefly talked about events. Events are a key part of how women's health services outreach to communities. And if a woman with disabilities was to take part in an event, how accessible would it be? How would it be possible for her to promote her perspectives? Are there accessibility provisions in place? Is there Auslan interpreting, captioning? Are the invitations in accessible formats? Is the venue accessible? Is it accessible by transport other than, a carer who might just happen to be a perpetrator of violence, and the only way that a woman can get there is in his car? Or is it close to various forms of public transport? Is assistance with transport offered? And then is the venue and the premises of the Women's Health Service accessible? So can women actually access the building? Can they enter without steps? Can they navigate the building? Is there signage? What about bathrooms? They're often quite important at events, but as in workplaces as well. And when we were compiling the audit and speaking to the Women's Health Services who assisted us to pilot the audit, we talked a lot about facilities where, bathrooms were sometimes used as storage facilities when they weren't being used, which meant that they weren't accessible to women as needed. So the tool is very comprehensive, and we, wanted to, in creating the tool, we drew on the expertise of our experts by experience, as Bianca described, to really illustrate that inclusion was more than just acknowledging that women with disabilities had a right to be in the place. It was about creating conditions that promoted participation and, in fact, welcomed it. So we, Women with Disabilities Victoria, are planning an event on the 3rd of December to which everyone is very welcome. And at that event, we'll be hearing more from a panel of speakers, women with disabilities, who will talk about prevention, and the theme this year of respect is what that implies for women with disabilities. We'll be launching a number of our resources to support workplaces, such as the resource that Bianca described, the poster, the auditing toolkit, and many others. So we're hoping that this presentation will be the start of a conversation with all of you, and we very much look forward to engaging with you further. Thank you.